Familia querida, público amado, nos encontramos con dos invitadazos de lujo en nuestro programa, que ¿cómo se llama, Sergio?
Espántame, Panteón.
No, se llama Asústame, Panteón, pero está bien, a fin de cuentas es lo mismo, entonces está muy bien. Estamos en Asústame, Panteón, estamos de manteles largos porque tenemos a dos invitadazos, como les decía, de lujo. Son dos personas que han trabajado muchos conceptos dentro de la academia, muy interesantes, muy de izquierda, muy de la onda marxista, y la verdad es que es algo muy, muy lindo tenerlos aquí con nosotros, aquí en Puebla, acá en el Instituto de Ciencias Sociales y Humanidades Alfonso Vélez Pliego. Nos sentimos, la verdad, muy, ¿cómo decirlo? Nos sentimos muy contentos, verdaderamente muy contentos, porque es una gran oportunidad tenerlos aquí. A mi lado, además, todavía me siento más privilegiado de tenerlos aquí a mi lado. y bueno, pues sin más preámbulo, vamos a presentar a nuestros invitados, que son de este lado Silvia Federici. Hi Silvia, how are you?
Hi René, very well, and I'm very honored to be here with you.
Muy bien. Y de este lado tenemos a George Cafensis. Hi George, how are you?
Hello, how are you doing? Hello to everyone who's watching or will watch. This is a beautiful place to talk, and we're having a cafe conversation, right?
That's right, we are having a café conversation. Bueno, aquí va un primer apunte. Voy a hablar en inglés y en español dependiendo de la situación, pero no se preocupen porque cuando venga la onda del inglés, ya sea de mi parte o del lado de mis invitados, vamos a poner algunos subtítulos para que todo el mundo entienda, ¿sale? Entonces no se preocupen, todo el mundo le va a entender y vamos a comenzar pues con esta plática. We're gonna start with this talk, with this chat, with this kind of cafe, and with both of you I want to discuss a little bit why, starting from your works, this idea of struggle. I think this is a very important idea in your works, in both works. First, maybe you can go with, who wants to answer first?
I can try.
Try it.
Well, I think the question of the struggle is extremely important. First of all, you know, for immemorable time, at least in every society, in every time in which people have been exploited, people have been oppressed, the struggle, it's really part of the reproduction of life. You can understand people's experiences unless you understand their struggles. And moreover, we have come to the conclusion, and we are not alone in that if we want to understand social change, if we want to understand social reality, for example, if we want to understand the reality of capitalism, what is capitalism, how it changes, why new policies are brought into place, we need to understand the struggles that people are doing. In other words, social change does not happen as a kind of autonomous process. Society does not evolve out of an inner mechanism. It changes in response to struggle that people are making, that are forcing the authority, basically are changing the status quo. And in the sense, we say we always have to start from the struggle. We want, for example, to understand neoliberalism, the globalization, we have to start from the struggles that people have made, which have culminated in the 60s and 70s, and in a sense have forced the system to change.
So we have here an important idea in Spanish. Aquí tenemos una idea bien importante que es lo que nos dice Silvia, que es comenzar desde la lucha. Nosotros tenemos que comenzar desde la lucha en nuestras vidas y en nuestros procesos de reproducción, que ahorita vamos a hablar un poquito más con Silvia, que es más especialista en esto, a qué nos estamos refiriendo con reproducción. Pero ahora vamos con George, ¿qué les parece? Vamos a ver ahora cuál es la idea que él tiene, que George tiene respecto de la lucha. What is your idea about the struggle? Why to start from struggle?
Well, let's start from right here, right now. When we look around us, we see that actually when we want to understand those bars over there, when we want to understand how this whole structure has been built, almost like a castle or fort, yeah. Right? We have to understand that this is not just for architectural pleasure, but that actually it's a product of an act of past struggles and present ones. And in fact, so much of the organization of social life in class society is built around a struggle against the rulers, and the rulers' coercion of the working classes. And this realizes itself in so many ways all around us. And it's congealed, so to speak. So actually, so much of social life is congealed past struggles. And we have to understand that when the architecture changes, it's usually in response to a struggle that has occurred.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you notice this in the organization of the architecture of universities in the United States. There was a tremendous student movement in the 1960s and 70s. And almost immediately afterwards, the architecture of the universities changes to become much more instead of these open areas, that becomes much more almost a kind of military style is built into the university.
Yeah.
So we have to, that's my way of adding to the point that Sylvia.
Struggle. Yeah.
Yeah, if you want to understand what's around us, immediately you have to look and see how is the struggle sedimented into our everyday life.
At all levels.
Even at the level in which people carry their body. Even the way people carry their body, you can read their struggle or their defeats.
Algo que nos están diciendo nuestros invitados y es muy importante es que tenemos que partir de lo que está inmediatamente alrededor de nosotros, incluso desde nuestro mismo cuerpo, como lo decía ahorita Silvia. George, sobre todo, nos estaba comentando que, por ejemplo, esta edificación que tenemos aquí del instituto, aunque es muy bonita, en realidad no fue nada más por puro placer arquitectónico, sino que también tiene una estructura de castillo, que también obedece a una lucha de clase. Hay una lucha también en esta arquitectura porque marca una dominación, marca una opresión. Y también nos daba algunos ejemplos en las universidades de Estados Unidos cuando empezaron a introducirse algunas construcciones de tipo militar dentro de las universidades y que también marcaban una cuestión de lucha. Así que el concepto de lucha, como nos lo están diciendo aquí nuestros invitadísimos, también aquí en el entorno más inmediato, en lo más cercano a nosotros, también está muy presente. La lucha está muy presente tanto alrededor de nosotros, en lo más cercano, como incluso dentro de nuestros cuerpos, que también afecta a nuestros cuerpos, como Silvia también lo estaba apuntando. Y bueno, para seguir con esta plática, algo que me gustaría preguntarles a ellos también es cómo han ellos participado en algunos movimientos sociales. How do you took part in some social movements in your place? For example, in your case, in Italy, maybe in New York or the United States also. In your case also with this kind of student movement that you're talking about, a student movement, and maybe you have taken part in this kind of movements. And so I want to know how is your experience in these social movements? Silvia.
Well, it's a long story, you know. We are not young people, so we have a long history behind us. I started when I traveled. I went to study in the United States, where I went to do my doctorate in the 1960s, and I became involved immediately in the student movement, and this was one of the experiences that was most important for me, because it was my first true political experience. It was also my way of learning, coming into contact with the American social reality. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it was a tremendous moment of learning. Later on, I was involved in the women's movement. I was involved in a campaign for many years in the feminist movement, in a campaign called International Campaign for Wages for Housework, where we were fighting to ask to force the government to remunerate reproductive work. You know, it was, of course, for housework, not for housewife, and it was part of our decision, you know, and our understanding that one of the causes of women's oppression is the fact that they've been confined to a type of labor that is never recognized as social labor, And not only is not recognized, is made invisible, but is not remunerated. In fact, there's a direct connection between the fact that this work is not remunerated and the fact that it's been made invisible, is not recognized as work. So we launched this campaign in part because of clearly the need for women not to be economically dependent on men and to have some level of power, for example, towards every situation in society, to have some money of their own, but also to bring forward to the foreground, the fact that in our capitalist society, the work of reproduction is not considered work, is devalued, is degraded, even though this is the most important work, because the work of reproduction actually reproduces workers on a day-to-day and on a generational basis. And if this work did not take place, there would not be a workforce. So it's work from which all employers benefit from, but they're taking it for free. They're taking it for free. And so this is the campaign that we were involved in. Later on, I was involved in the struggle against globalization, particularly land expropriation, and in particular, I was involved in the way globalization and the privatization has affected education. I am a teacher. I've been teaching for many, many years, particularly in the universities, and the fact that universities more and more have become very commercialized and introduced fees in the United States, very high fees. So they're going to school is really going to school with tears because, students pay a very high cost for the certificate that they receive. So I very much, I took the struggle of the students also as our own struggle. Because definitely I don't want to teach students who are going to become servants to the banks. I will leave it at that.
Bueno, pues la verdad es que Silvia nos ha compartido muchísima información y voy a intentar destacar lo más importante de lo que nos dijo, que es importantísimo. Ella efectivamente ha participado ya en algunos movimientos, también cuando ella fue para Estados Unidos empezó a dar cuenta de muchas situaciones en América y sobre todo la primera campaña que se lanzó y en la que ella estuvo involucrada fue en la remuneración del trabajo doméstico. Esto es importantísimo porque nosotros, y lo vamos a abordar un poquito más adelante con ella, muchas veces naturalizamos el trabajo doméstico como un trabajo que no se paga. Y es un trabajo de reproducción porque reproduce la fuerza de trabajo. O sea, todos los que somos trabajadores venimos de una mamá. Y esa mamá muchas veces hace la gran labor doméstica de la casa. Entonces, lo que Silvia, estaba en la campaña en la que ella estaba comprometida era de que se remunerara a las amas de casa, porque es importante en este trabajo de reproducción. Eso lo vamos a seguir abordando un poquito más adelante. Pero además, otra cosa en la que también se involucró Silvia y que creo que se va a conectar mucho con lo que dice George, es la situación de los estudiantes. Aparte de que estuvo involucrada en el movimiento de la globalización o contra la globalización y contra la privatización, sobre todo de la privatización educativa, que ese tema es fundamental en México porque incluso en la primera emisión de Asústame Panteón, o sea, nuestro programa, hablamos acerca de la reforma educativa en México y la privatización de la educación. Cada vez en las universidades, lo que nos comenta Silvia es que las cuotas, las colegiaturas, las tarifas, vienen siendo cada vez más altas, y no nada más de las universidades privadas, sino también de las universidades públicas. Entonces Silvia, con toda esta experiencia, nos decía, no le voy a estar enseñando a mis estudiantes a estar tranquilos, a estar pasivos, no, al contrario, es una cuestión de envalentarlos también, de encourage them, o sea,
But above all, I see that struggle, for example, for free education, it's also my struggle.
La lucha por una educación libre no es nada más una lucha de los estudiantes, sino que también es una lucha de Silvia. En ese sentido ella está comprometida, ¿no? Y ahora nos vamos a pasar con George, que es uno de sus temas pues especiales, esta cuestión de movimiento estudiantil, pero sobre todo contra la abolición de la deuda, debt abolition.
Right.
What can you tell to us? Tell us about this movement of debt abolition, this struggle against tuition fees. So tell us, George.
Okay, I'm happy to do so because this is my political work, the center of my political work right now. And I'm glad to be here in the University of Puebla to speak to students and faculty members about the struggle that's going on in the United States. Because it's, I think, a relevant struggle because there's so much to learn from Mexico about debt abolition. For example, one of the things that I'm doing now in my visit here to Mexico is trying to meet with former militants or present participants in an organization, a debt abolition organization, which I think is of great importance, not only for Mexico, but also around the world, and certainly for the United States, El Barzón. Debt abolition or an anti-debt movement in Mexico in the mid-1990s. In the United States, there have been anti-debt organizations, movements, and rebellions even. Immediately after the American War of Independence, there was basically a debtors' armed revolt against the bankers and the merchants that were basically using defaulting loans to appropriate the land of poor farmers who had fought in the Revolutionary War. So they banded together, and here it's in 1786, banded together to open up the debtors' prisons, because at that time people who defaulted on debt would be put into prison. Open up the debtors' prison and demand that the debts be eliminated. This was an important struggle. It's called Shays Rebellion, after the name of the leader, Daniel Shays. So it's not a new story, but the issue of debt has become front and center of politics in the United States, of class politics in the United States, because in 2008, with the financial crisis, the United States government basically sent trillions of dollars to the large banks and financial corporations, insurance companies, and so on, but almost no financial help to those who most desperately needed it, who were losing their homes because they couldn't keep up with the mortgage payments, or who were student loan debtors who couldn't keep up with the student loan debt repayments because they were unemployed, given the economic crisis. And in general, it was very much a very class-biased bailout, as they say in the United States. The powerful and financial capitalists got saved at the tune of trillions of dollars, whereas the people who depended upon houses, education, health, for much of the United States, debt is health debt. People who have to go to the hospital and get operations, but are not covered by any insurance, for example. And so they have to go into debt, and often they can't continue paying it. So what we discovered in 2008 is that there's a debt economy. Those who are on the top get saved. Those who are on the bottom
they don't get a chance.
Get thrown, as we say in the United States, get thrown under the bus, which is a very common expression, I'm afraid. So after 2008, many new organizations were formed across the country, including an organization that I'm involved with now, and it's called Strike Debt. And if you want to know more about it, you can just go to www.strikedebt.org. Strike debt. And striking as if striking against the debt.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's my present political involvement. And as I said, I'm interested in speaking to members of the El Barzón movement because I think there's lots to learn in terms of political organization, tactics, and so on from Mexico. So I say hello to all the former or present El Barzón members, and and I'd like to definitely hear from them.
Bueno, pues también nuestro querido George nos ha botado una gran información. Y bueno, para mostrar dos ideas así muy fuertes de lo que nos acaba de decir, una de ellas es que él, en su movimiento político, digamos, pertenece a uno que se llama Huelga de la Deuda, y que incluso se puede encontrar en www.strikedebt.com, que ya después se los voy a pasar ahí en el programa, esa página, para que lo puedan checar. Y bueno, desde ahí se han hecho algunas acciones, pero también algo que nos dice George desde antes es que, y sobre todo en 2008, vino algo que él le llama una economía de la deuda. Y esto lo explica porque resulta que los servicios públicos en Estados Unidos, cuando estos servicios públicos deberían estar garantizados para toda la población, resulta que no hay el presupuesto para garantizar estos servicios públicos, y entonces la gente, por ejemplo, para cuestiones de salud, seguridad social, incluso la misma educación, tiene que recurrir a la deuda, tiene que recurrir al préstamo, tiene que recurrir al crédito para que pueda tener acceso a servicios fundamentales para la vida. Y además, algo que nos decía George desde antes es que esto ya tiene su historia desde hace varios años atrás, porque ya había habido revueltas, ya había habido rebeliones para anular cuestiones de deuda. Entonces la deuda aquí se vuelve un concepto muy importante porque de alguna manera nos sigue amarrando a esta lógica capitalista de la cual vamos a estar hablando todavía con nuestros invitados. Y en este sentido, siguiendo un poquito con George, ya que él fue, he was the last speaking, so I'm gonna take here a chance. Do you think there is kind of discipline with this issue of debt, social discipline? Is there a social role of debt to discipline people, to educate, how can I say, labor work, workforce, or force work? Absolutely. So, what do you think about it?
I think that what you're saying is perfectly true, and basically, remember when I said the student movement of the 1960s and 70s was responded to architecturally, right? But there was also a financial response. What begins to happen in the 1970s is that in public universities, that if they were not totally free, they were very low tuition fees. Beginning in the late 1970s, they start to rise. And they start to rise as if it's going off to the skies. Between 1985 and present, it's gone up 5 times on average, the tuition fees in public universities, not in private ones. Private ones often are twice that amount. So what we have is a situation that begins in response to the students' struggle against, against the war and the war economy, but it was also against the discrimination against black and Latino students to this very day. But at that time, there was a huge movement that basically took the universities in hand and began to shake the foundations of the universities. So in response, one of the responses was to increase the amount of fees that you need to pay in order to get into the university, and to increase the loan debt that you need to use in order to pay the fees. So what happens now is that the average student debtor has about $30,000 debt when they leave the university. And this is a source of tremendous discipline on the student, a discipline that basically makes every student think twice before they make a political commitment to go to a demonstration, because they often are in very much, in order to pay the debt, they're continually thinking about what a second job or a third job. They're continually thinking about what would be a kind of job that I could have that would allow me to pay off the debt, instead of looking for work that would be what they would want to do or have some desire for, or at least be free to take on a direct political commitment after finishing the university. So the debt, along with the tuition increases, was also a response to that struggle, as Sylvia says. That's where we begin. If you want to find out why things change, why has there suddenly been, we have calculated, we in Strike Debt have calculated that it would be very simple for the U.S. government and the state governments to reduce the tuition fees to zero. It's not a huge expense at all. And it's certainly a small fraction of what is spent for defense, so-called defense, arms, basically. So, yes, debt is very much part of the disciplining of students, and not only of students, but after. You see, it has a kind of radioactive effect. It continues on long after you leave, because we know of people who are in their 50s and 60s who are still paying off their student debt. Yes. Yes, from their student debt. There's a lot to say about this, and I love the cafe, but you know, there would be. It is important for Mexican students to know, because they're increasingly facing the threat of a tremendous increase in there, and they have to realize that from the American experience, this could become a very a grave attack, not only upon their education, but also upon their political possibilities.
Evasão. Can become evasão, see, because the death disciplines you for the rest of your life. As long as you have the debt, you have no choice about what kind of work you're going to choose, whether or not you can refuse a job that you don't like, how many hours you work, because you have to pay. Because if you do not pay, for example, if you begin to skip some payment, then what happens is that the interest rate go up. And very shortly, you know, even your debt begins to multiply. So you really do not have a choice to continuously pay. And we have people who, at one point, because they couldn't pay, almost went underground, you know. And so it's an immense instrument of social discipline.
Pues bueno, antes de que nos vayamos a corte, porque ya Sergio me está corriendo otra vez, pero lo hace con cariño, siempre lo he dicho. Hay muchísimas ideas importantes que nos acaban de dar, pero básicamente la idea importante aquí son los peligros de la deuda. Los peligros de la deuda en el caso de Estados Unidos, y que pueden ser un ejemplo para la lucha en México también, que es un poco lo que nos comparte George y también una parte Silvia, pues es que te puedes quedar endeudado de por vida en tu educación. O sea, si la quieres pagar, lo que pasa en Estados Unidos es que necesitas conseguir un segundo o un tercer trabajo para poder pagarla, y un poco lo que nos dice Silvia es que incluso ni siquiera puedes llegar a pagarla completamente, porque si te atrasas, te llegan los intereses, y entonces con los intereses pues se te sigue subiendo la deuda y se va multiplicando la deuda, y entonces no acabas de pagarla. Entonces, y además, otra cosa que George también nos decía y que también es muy importante, pues es que, o sea, imagínense, o sea, tienen la deuda causa una condición, un condicionamiento. O sea, en lugar de que el estudiante salga a tener un compromiso político en contra de la deuda, por esta cuestión de la deuda se siente muy amarrado y prefiere ir a buscar más trabajo que en realidad ir a luchar, ir a sumarse a un movimiento para abolir o acabar con su deuda, que son deudas también que podrían pasar por ser injustas, porque solamente están multiplicando el dinero y lo que tú tienes que estar pagando por un derecho que cada uno tiene, que es el derecho a la educación. Es un derecho básico, vaya, y también universalmente reconocido. Nos vamos a corte y regresamos con nuestros invitadazos. No se me vayan. Muy bien, estamos de regreso en nuestro programa que ahora sí ya sabe, Sergio, cómo se llama, ¿verdad? ¿Se llama cómo? Perfecto, se llama Asústame Panteón, muy bien. Conforme lo estemos ensayando en diferentes emisiones, lograremos gritarlo todo y además con invitados seguramente que nos van a llegar. Bueno, pues lo que les decía es que estamos de manteles largos en nuestro programa porque tenemos a dos invitadazos de lujo, que es Silvia Federici. Es más, creo que tuve el error de no... No, es cierto, sí los presenté, ya me acordé. Pero bueno, los vuelvo a presentar. Es Silvia Federici, ella viene de Italia, ha trabajado muchas cosas sobre feminismo, patriarcado, capitalismo, reproducción. Y parte de eso es lo que vamos a abordar ahora en este segundo bloque, sobre todo, puesto que en el primer bloque abordamos un poquito más de algunas cuestiones de deuda y de las luchas por la deuda económica, eso nos referimos, y sobre todo en la parte educativa. Del otro lado hemos tenido a George Cafensis, él es de Estados Unidos y ha hecho un trabajo muy, muy importante en esto que acabo de mencionar. Así que retomamos este café que estamos teniendo con ellos. So, George, how can I say that? Let's make a small conclusion with a couple of questions. The first question maybe could be, well, we achieved the debt abolition. What is next?
Well, we in Strike Debt started off with the end as being debt abolition, what we call the Jubilee. Okay?
Jubilee.
The Jubilee, yeah. Well, it's like I'm a jubilado,
Mm-hmm.
all right, which means I'm retired. But in ancient times, the Jubilee was the time when debts were canceled, slaves were freed, and land went back to the original owners.
Oh.
That was an ancient, basically what we now call Middle Eastern tradition. Okay? Now, but we realized that actually, if that was our only demand, and we still had what we call the debt economy. Debt, even after debt was released, was abolished, within a few years, the debt machine would have been working almost as if it hadn't happened. So what really we need to do, and what our campaign is now focusing on, is, yes, we need debt abolition, but what we need is freedom from the debt economy. What we've defined the debt economy as being is that in order for you to satisfy your basic needs, education, health, housing, and so on, you have to go into debt, and into basically lifelong debt. This is a reality for much of the American working class. And so what we're talking about is not only making debt abolition a crucial first step, but also the next step is to begin to disassemble, to break down the debt economy. And that's why we find the issue of student fees very important, because there's now $1 trillion, more than $1 trillion of student loan debt outstanding in the United States. Yes, the abolition of that debt would be very important. But what we're arguing is that within 10 years, if the present tuition fees are the same, we'd be back to the same situation. So we're arguing that in our political efforts, it's very important that we put along with the demand for debt abolition, the demand for tuition-free education, education that is not a commodity. That's really key because once you define it as a commodity, often you say, well, the government says, oh, it's only for $500. It isn't much. But within a very short time, once you defined it as a commodity, it starts growing. It's very much like the debt that Sylvia says. Once you're in it, it has its own machine, and you're gobbled up in it.
And it starts over and over again?
It starts over and over again, and that's its terror, and that's its horror, basically. I mean, horror movies, I think, are little, trivial compared to the horror that people experience with their debt. So this is from why it's very important that we don't just take dead abolition as the political terminus. Okay.
Bueno, pues George nos acaba de lanzar un argumento muy bueno que ya habrá sido traducido a través de los subtítulos, pero yo voy a resumir un poquito también. Pues básicamente lo que nos dice es que aquí el movimiento no se terminaría nada más con la abolición de la deuda, sí, nada más, sino que verdaderamente o sea, ya no habría nada, o sea, no es nada más terminar en algún momento con la deuda, porque si no, si se siguen aplicando incluso pequeñas tarifas, pequeñas colegiaturas, de todos modos por los intereses y los cobros se va a seguir multiplicando y regresamos a la misma dinámica de la deuda. Entonces, el compromiso aquí que nos dice George es terminar completamente con las tarifas en la educación, o sea, la educación gratuita. Ahora sí, lo que dice el artículo 3º de nuestra Constitución mexicana, que es educación gratuita, que es algo que no tenemos en México, pero que allí está en la Constitución, eso tendría que ser educación verdaderamente gratuita, que en palabras de George significa sin tarifas, no colegiaturas. Ese es uno de los puntos importantes y ese sería el ánimo del movimiento en el cual George está comprometido. Ahora bien, importantísimo este punto, pero también nos vamos a pasar a otro punto con Silvia, porque nos va a hablar, bueno, este concepto es interesantísimo, sobre todo porque a nosotros, sobre todo aquí creo yo que en América, nos pintaron este cuento de la casa de brujas como una leyenda, como una historia así de verdaderamente de las brujitas de las caricaturas, de que el sombrerito, el vestidito, y en realidad resulta que Silvia se puso a investigar la casa de brujas como un hecho real, o sea, algo que sí pasó, pero que en la historia no está suficientemente documentado o hay muy pocos documentos. Entonces Silvia dijo, a ver, ¿qué pasa con la casa de brujas? Y es de lo que le vamos a preguntar. Silvia, you have a very powerful argument. Oh, my paper. Thank you. A very powerful argument with witch hunting. Right. So, why to start historical analysis of society from witch hunting? Are you trying to rewrite history with this? Because that was introduced to us as a legend. So, what can you say about that?
It is very interesting and appalling that the witch hunt, which in fact, but first of all, the witch hunt took place both in Europe and also in the Americas, and led to the death and torture of hundreds and hundreds of women. That these witch hunts have been turned into not only a legend, but something of a joke. For example, every year in the United States, at Halloween, you find, little girls who are dressed like witches. And trick or treat, it's a little children's play. So imagine what it would be if we think of other massacre or extermination, if they would have been turned into something of a play, into something of, a cultural joke. So it's very interesting concerning history, the history of the witch hunt, that it was the feminist movement in the 70s that really reawakened our consciousness, of the importance of the witch hunt, because as feminists began to engage in some studies of women's history, they wanted to basically reconstruct women's history from women's point of view. Women's history has always been written from a man's point of view, from the point of view of male scholars. So they went back into history and they encountered the witch hunt, as I did. And they realized very immediately, as I did, that the witch hunt is something extremely important, is an extremely important historical phenomenon. The witch hunt begins around the 15th century in Europe, and it lasts for about 2 or 3 centuries. And it was very important, very, very important for me to realize when I started doing this work that the witch hunt was contemporary with the slave trade, was contemporary with the colonization and conquest of America, It was contemporary also with all those processes that in Europe led to the development of capitalism, like the expulsion of the peasantry from the land that they had used, throughout the Middle Ages. So it was very clear that the witch hunt was not something that belonged to, the feudal world, a world that we always imagine as more superstitious, but that in fact it was part of the building of modern capitalist society. And so the work that I have done has been to try to understand in what way the witch hunt really was, in a sense, functional to the development of capitalism. And I came to the conclusion that actually the witch hunts of the 16th, 17th century were a determinant moment of capitalist development. First of all, at the time in which the whole campesinatus in Europe was under attack, because land was being privatized, because you have the beginning, you have a major price inflation, caused by the silver that was being extracted by the Peruvian and the Mexican mine at a time of massive starvation, impoverishment, expulsion from the land. You also have this attack that comes from the state, comes from the governments, against women who massively, particularly in the rural area, particularly older and poor women, are accused of being witches. And then I began to ask, who were the witches? And looking at who were these women socially, what crimes they were accused of, I came to the realization that in fact the witch hunt managed to erase a whole population of people whose type of living, his behavior, his practices could not be compatible with the development of the capitalist discipline of work. For instance, many witches were beggars. They were women who were supporting themselves, with begging around, they are better off for some milk, some food, some butter. And when they were refused, they were cursing those who refused them, and then they were accused, of causing harm, killing the cow, killing the child, any misfortune that happened in the family was imputed to them. So it's very clear here that the attack on the witch is the attack on the poor, that he is not accepting, her poverty, right? And is an attack on the poor who is still trying to enforce certain principle of solidarity and mutual aid, demanding to be helped. And also we find that many of the witches, the so-called witches, were midwives, and I connect this attack on the midwives who were accused of helping women to kill children, helping women to carry on contraception. And in fact, witches were accused of being a sect.
What is midwives?
Midwives is las personas, las mujeres que ayudan las mujeres a partorir. Sí, sí. I connect this attack on the midwife with the fact that with the development of capitalism, the state begins to take control over the women's body, because it begins to see the women's body, as a vehicle, as an instrument for the production of the workforce. And capitalism is a system that places a high value on labor, the exploitation of labor, not land by itself, but the exploitation of labor is really the source of wealth. So to have many workers, the more workers you have and the more you can squeeze their bodies, the more wealth can be accumulated. So for women now procreation begins to be seen in conjunction with the labor market. And the uterus becomes the vehicle for the production of the workforce. So we see this effort to break the control that women had over reproduction in the Middle Ages. And it's not an accident throughout the history of capitalist society. For many, in fact, for centuries, for example, the infanticide is punished with capital punishment, and contraception is severely abolished, severely forbidden. No? So we also have many witches who were prostitutes or had been prostitutes in their youth. And again, I interpret this attack as a way of regulating women's sexuality. Regulating women's sexuality because women's sexuality begins to be seen as something dangerous, as something subversive with respect to the capitalist discipline of work. So in conclusion, and there's a lot more to say, but in conclusion, you know, the witch hunt is defining because the witch hunt was really a moment of social reform. It was a moment in which a new type of work discipline, a new type of worker, and a new type of discipline of women in particular was implemented. And it was instrumental to reform the family, to reform sexuality, you know, to reform women's relation to men. So in a way, the witch hunt creates the new codes, you know, the new codes, moral codes. It creates the new image of women. It creates the new code of the discipline that women have to subject it to. And so it had a very long-lasting effect on the history of women, the condition of women in Europe. And I want to add, it's very important, that the witch hunt was exported by the missionaries and the colonizers also to the Americas. In fact, the last chapter of my book is precisely on that. And to Mexico, in Mexico, it was also used against men, for example, against many chiefs, to force them to give gold, because the conquistadores were convinced the people were holding all this gold. So they were actually accused of being brujos, devil worshippers, and the charge of devil worshipping was very much used against the population of the Americans as a means of a justification for enslavement. But in the Andean region, in particular, it was women who was especially attacked as brujas. And there is a lot of literature showing the women were the main target because they also were those who resisted colonization more directly. Also because the colonizer brought with them a very degraded image of women and instituted a subordination of women to men that had not existed, you know, in the Mesoamerican cultures.
Of course.
And I have to add that the witch hunt now are coming back. In fact, witch accusation of women are moved against many women in parts of Africa, in India, Nepal, and in my work, in my research, I've been showing that once again there's a direct connection between the surge of these charges and the processes that sustain the development of globalization.
Muy bien, pues nuevamente nos han lanzado un chorrísimo de ideas, un montón de ideas. Y Silvia, bueno, pues, híjole, voy a hacer una pequeña acotación, así muy resumida, groseramente resumida, pero nada más para entender un poquito de lo que nos está ella comentando. Básicamente nos está diciendo que gracias a toda esta expropiación para formar el capitalismo se tuvo que apropiar de la mujer. Así, básicamente. Se tuvo que apropiar de su trabajo, se tuvo que apropiar de su cuerpo. Y esto no fue casual que haya coincidido con los años de los 1500, cuando vino la conquista de América. O sea, todo esto de la conquista de América, la colonización, todo esto que nosotros sabemos también de nuestra historia, también se vino con esta casa de brujas, y fue para controlar a la mujer. Incluso algo de lo que nos decía Silvia es que ya había ejemplos, por ejemplo, de mujeres autogestionadas que tenían su trabajo, no sé, tal vez tenían sus granjas, sus animales, sus parcelas, lo que sea, pero resulta que la manera en que ellas vivían de manera autogestionada por ellas mismas no era compatible con el modelo capitalista que necesita comerse a la gente, necesita incorporar fuerza de trabajo, necesita incorporar las tierras, necesita expropiar o privatizar, como se le llama, privatizar las tierras, para poder desarrollarse como sistema. Básicamente lo que hace el capitalismo es comernos, pero lo que hizo Silvia en su investigación es decir, cómo específicamente el capitalismo se comió a la mujer. incluso fue controlando su cuerpo, porque a través de su cuerpo se logra la reproducción humana, y con la reproducción humana logramos ¿qué? Pues tener más fuerza de trabajo, que somos todos los trabajadores y trabajadoras, todas las personas. Por eso lo que les decía, pues todos venimos de una mamá, ¿no? O bueno, la mayoría, porque también ya hay hijos de probeta y esas cosas. Pero pero bueno, digamos, como normalmente lo entendemos, vaya, nuestras madres, o hermanas, tías, lo que sea, cuando ellas se reproducen, están también reproduciendo a los siguientes trabajadores y trabajadoras que alimentan el sistema capitalista. Entonces, para el capitalismo siempre fue muy importante poderse apoderar de su mujer, de la mujer, perdón, o del cuerpo de la mujer e incluso de la sexualidad de la mujer, que es lo que Silvia nos estaba comentando. Es un resumen muy grosero, pero como ya les dije, los subtítulos que vamos a colocar antes, obviamente pues van a dar idea de todo esto. Ahora bien, una última preguntilla que le vamos a hacer a Silvia, porque bueno, pues ya vimos el problema, ¿no? Ahora vamos a ver un poquito como el horizonte, vamos a ver un poquito qué podemos hacer como para cambiar este modelo de reproducción capitalista. Tal vez lo vamos a hacer como con dos preguntitas. The first question is, well, you're starting from reproduction and not production. This is an important issue also.
Yes.
And what to do to change this reproductive model of capitalism? What are the alternatives? Another way to make things different? So maybe if you can show us some ideas about the situation.
Yeah. Yes, reproduction, because fundamentally reproduction is the most important system, is the most important type of activity, is the one that supports, in our society, every form of production. There will be no type of work. Plus reproduction is what reproduces our lives. And it's very important to see that in capitalism, reproductive activities have always two sides, because on one side they are important because they reproduce our life, but on the other they also reproduce us as future workers. And there is always a contradiction there. There is always a contrast. In fact, parents live that contrast every day. Every day you have to decide how you're going to reproduce your child. Yeah. What is the real well-being of your child? Is to discipline them and figure out, okay, we have to train them so they can get this job or that job, and that means many times going against their desires, imposing type of discipline, which are very painful, yes, or reproducing, what we say, reproducing for your well-being, for your happiness, or for the struggle. Yeah. So in a way, what I want to stress is that our main political task, or at least one main political task, is to make sure, to struggle to make sure that our reproduction reproduces us for our well-being, and not so that we can be more intensely exploited or more efficiently exploited. And there are many things that we need to do. First of all, I think central to every struggle, because there are many, many, many fronts of struggle, but central to every struggle is the fact that we need to revalorize reproduction. Because capitalism is a system that has to necessarily devalue reproduction. And that's why domestic work has been made invisible. That's why it is not paid. Because in this way, you contain the cost of labor. Devaluing reproduction is the way of cheapening, people's labor, right? So, in a way, we have to change this situation, and we have to change the awareness that people have of reproductive activity, and to show that in fact these are the most important activity. And if sometimes, they appear as drudgery, like women have thought, it's because they have been turned into something non-creative. But potentially reproductive activities are very creative. So in the past, in the 70s, You know, my politics was, okay, the first step we need to do is wages for housework, you know, because women need the money. We need the money to be independent, and also in the way housework will be desexualized. If it were paid, if it was a regular job, men would more easily do it too. Also, you know, wages for housework was a way of making people aware that this is work. This is not the personal service that women are doing to men, but this is work from which all society benefits, all employers benefits, and they are making an immense amount of money out of our unpaid labor. I have not changed my mind about the fact that it would be important if housework were remunerated. But I also want to add something else. I think it's also extremely important today that we begin to transform, to change the organization of this work, you know, and we begin, first of all, to organize forms of reproduction that are increasingly autonomous from the wage system, autonomous from the market, and autonomous from the state. I think that we have many examples. I know that Latin America is one example, where a lot of women, you know, particularly in the urban periphery of the many cities of Peru, Mexico, Argentina, Chile, have begun to create more autonomous forms of reproduction by bringing together their resources, pooling their resources, and also bringing together their work. For example, con il Comedores Popolare, the urban gardens, and shopping together, and so beginning to create more cooperative forms of reproduction that also transform the process of reproduction itself and transform the women who are engaging in them. And I think also that the work of reproduction has to be transformed and has to be made more cooperative. It has to be in the form of more of a common, because it is work that is very laborious. It's very labor intensive.
Of course.
You know, taking care of a child, taking care of an elderly person who is not self-sufficient. It's a work that kills you if you are doing it alone. And many women have been killed in a sense. All their energies have been depleted, you know. So we need, and moreover, you know, the way capitalism has organized this work, all the little houses separate, you know, so that this work is done in isolation. Women and men do it in isolation from each other. It's very weakening, you know, disaggregate people. It undermines social solidarity. So I think we have to work on all this level in order to transform it, into transforming something that is really what it can be, what reproductive work potentially can be, which is one of the most creative works on earth, because creating the new forms of life and creating the new generation, creating the new society.
Of course. Pues bien, otra vez Silvia nos acaba de soltar un rollo buenísimo, buenísimo, buenísimo. Y básicamente con dos ideas muy fuertes. Una, primero, ¿por qué reproducción tendría que ser algo un poquito más llamativo que lo que es la producción? Muchas veces nosotros pensamos más en producción, pero la reproducción llega a ser un ámbito, una cosa un poquito más abarcativa, abarca más. Y algo que nos estaba diciendo Silvia es que hay una devaluación. El capitalismo necesita devaluar la producción para seguir existiendo. Y una manera de devaluar la producción es la producción. Una manera de devaluar la producción es lo que produce la mujer justamente. Ahí hay una manera de devaluar su trabajo, porque resulta que el trabajo de la mujer efectivamente puede sostener el trabajo de todos los demás. Voy a poner, de todos los demás, hombres particularmente. Vamos a poner un ejemplo. Para los que están viviendo con sus madres, por ejemplo, que son una familia. La mamá, por ejemplo, que se queda a hacer los quehaceres de la casa, que no se le paga, pero que permite que tú, que nos estás viendo, salgas a trabajar. O sea, yo puedo tener a alguien en casa que perfectamente, alguien como mi madre o la hermana o la tía, qué sé yo, se pueda quedar en casa trabajando las cosas domésticas, toda la limpieza, lo que en inglés es el housekeeping,
Sí.
y pues chido, ¿no? O sea, pero entonces yo tengo la libertad de salir de casa y de tener más tiempo para hacer otras cosas, como tener un trabajo o a veces hasta 2 trabajos, porque conforme va pasando este proceso capitalista, a veces hasta necesitamos más trabajos, pero se nos olvida que hay alguien en casa que no está siendo pagada, que no está siendo remunerada y que está llevando un trabajo de producción. O sea, las amas de casa o las administradoras del hogar, ahora como también se les ha querido llamar en México, están cumpliendo una función de producción. Que no se les pague es diferente, pero sí están teniendo una labor de producción en el sistema capitalista, porque permite que todo el sistema se reproduzca justamente. Entonces eso es uno de los puntos de Silvia y por qué tan importante la reproducción, incluso un poquito más que solamente ver la producción, sino verlo en el sentido reproductivo. Y ahora, cuando Silvia nos menciona acerca de las alternativas, pues nos habla de que hay ya algunas alternativas que se están trabajando alrededor del mundo. Nos mencionaba algunas en América, como en México, en Argentina, en Chile, como los comedores populares, alternativas que son más autónomas, vaya. Nos estaba mencionando que hay que ver a esas alternativas también, que nos ayudan a pensar la reproducción, pero no solamente como la típica reproducción biológica como lo vemos, sino como un trabajo creativo. La reproducción también es la posibilidad de ser creativo y de intentar las cosas de manera diferente. Sobre todo una palabra que Silvia nos estaba señalando mucho era en términos de solidaridad, en términos de cooperación. Y hay algo que también ella nos está marcando muy clarito, que nosotros vivimos aislados, isolated, vivimos aislados, o sea, vivimos en nuestras casitas de manera muy individualizada y no vemos algo que también es una palabra política muy fuerte en los trabajos de nuestros 2 invitadazos, que es lo común. Nosotros muchas veces perdemos lo común de nuestra vida y vivimos de manera muy aislada, o sea, vamos a pensarlo aquí en México, en Puebla. Nosotros, aunque tenemos a nuestros vecinos, muchas veces no los pelamos, no hacemos caso, vivimos nada más en nuestra casa y lo que necesitemos dentro de nuestra casa, perfecto. Pero con la gente cercana con la que vivimos, es decir, con las otras casas, también tenemos puntos en común, o sea, compartimos paredes, compartimos servicios públicos, que son cosas comunes, y desde ahí se pueden ir generando algunas alternativas autónomas, por ejemplo, desde lo vecinal, con otras familias, intercambiando algunas cosas, siendo solidarios, siendo cooperativos, que en México ya sabemos un poquito de esto, por ejemplo, con las prácticas de la faena, con las prácticas del tequio, que se da en algunos pueblos, que nosotros, sobre todo en el espacio urbano, no lo tenemos mucho, pero en el campo sí se da bastante este trabajo colaborativo, este trabajo cooperativo, de decir, bueno, se necesita pavimentar esta calle. Entonces salen los vecinos del pueblo y van a pavimentar la calle. Y lo hacen en conjunto y todos le entran. Entonces, por ahí es donde... Pues bien, lo último que nos estaba señalando Silvia era la cuestión de la reproducción, de hacer las cosas de manera creativa. Hay un potencial de ser creativos cuando nos reproducimos. Y no nada más por reproducir hijos, vaya, sino que las formas en las que nosotros vivimos son también maneras de reproducirnos, tiene que ver con nuestra cultura, por ejemplo. Entonces, ahí nosotros tenemos un chance de hacer las cosas diferente, buscar algunas colaboraciones con otras personas con las cuales vivimos cerca y tal vez no tan cerca, pero es cierto, podemos empezar a hacer las cosas distintas y ya empieza a haber ejemplos en el mundo. Así que, pues bueno, pues creo que por aquí terminamos. Ha sido realmente un honor, ha sido un placer verdaderamente tener aquí a estos 2 invitadazos de lujo, que es Silvia Federici, George Jafensis, que nos compartieron perspectivas muy buenas y que esperamos que también sean bastante comprensibles para toda la gente que nos está viendo. Así es como lo estamos buscando hacer en nuestro programa Asústame Panteón. Yo por vía de mientras me voy despidiendo de ellos en el English, que es... This was real nice to have you here. We are very pleased to have you here in this institution, in this space, with us, with the Mexican people. So, I don't know if you want to say something else.
Thank you to you too, because it was a great pleasure and also, a great opportunity for us to communicate with people here in Mexico.
George.
This is politically very important that Mexicans and people in the U.S. see their common ties, because that's going to be central to the future of not only peoples in both sides of the border, but I think for the rest of the planet.
Algo que nos acaba de decir George, que también lo está compartiendo Silvia, para finalizar, es que más allá de la frontera, el pueblo de Estados Unidos y el pueblo de México se tienen que ver en común.
Sí.
Nos tenemos que ver en común para poder empezar a crear más cosas, y George dice que no nada más entre México y Estados Unidos, sino que también alrededor del mundo. También lo tenemos que ir viendo de esa forma, pero vaya, podemos empezar a hacer algo incluso entre México y Estados Unidos. Estados Unidos no es nada más su gobierno y la manera en que controla su deuda y esta economía de la deuda y sus ánimos supercapitalistas de comerse el mundo. No, hay un pueblo estadounidense muy consciente. George es un ejemplo de ellos. Silvia ahora también, digamos, porque ella vive allá, entonces pues también es parte de este movimiento. Y vaya, familia querida, público amado, pues muchas gracias por estarnos checando aquí en Asústame Panteón. Nos estamos viendo en las siguientes emisiones. No se me pierdan. Muchas gracias.